Ilara did not want to go to the Nightfall Gala. She had said so, quietly, at the dinner table 3 nights before the event. Her mother had looked at her the way she always did when Ilara spoke her own mind, not angry, not cruel, but with that particular tiredness that said the opinion was not needed. Her sister Seraphine had been talking about what dress she would wear, what hairstyle would suit the candlelit hall, which members of the vampire court were known to attend. And Ilara had said, softly, that she did not think she needed to go. "You will come," her mother had said. "And you will stand beside your sister. And you will smile." That was the end of the conversation. Ilara was 23 years old. She worked as a junior editor at a small publishing house in the city. She read books on her lunch breaks and walked home through the park even when it rained. She was not someone who attended galas. She was not someone who moved through grand rooms feeling like she belonged. But her family had received one of the rarest invitations in a generation, an invitation to the Nightfall Gala, hosted inside the ancient Dravet estate at the edge of the city, and her mother had decided that the whole family would attend. The Nightfall Gala was the one formal event at which the vampire nobility of their region opened their doors to the human world. It happened once every 100 years. It was not a celebration. It was not a party, exactly. It was more like a long, careful showing, a night where both wards observed one another with polite restraint, exchanged formal words, and went home unchanged. The vampires who attended were old. Their estate was older. The invitation carried a black wax seal that smelled faintly of pine resin and stone, and Ilara had held it for just a moment longer than necessary before handing it back to her mother. She had borrowed a grey gown from a colleague at work. It fit well enough. It was not the kind of dress that turned heads. That was fine. Seraphine's dress was deep crimson with a structured collar and a skirt that moved like water. Their mother had spent a week finding it. She had spent less than a morning finding something for Ilara, and Ilara had spent no time at all being offended by that. It was simply the way things were. It had always been the way things were. Seraphine was beautiful. Not in a way that required discussion or argument, she simply was, the way certain places simply are. She was 26, tall, golden-haired, with a way of entering a room that made people orient toward her without realizing they had done so. She was also kind, mostly. She loved Ilara, mostly. She simply loved herself first, and she had always been allowed to. Their father had died when Ilara was 9 and Seraphine was 12. Their mother had raised them alone, and she had done so by making very clear decisions about where her energy went. Seraphine was the investment. Ilara was the quiet one who turned out fine without much tending. This was not cruelty. It was simply a kind of unconscious arithmetic that their mother had never examined closely enough to question. Ilara had examined it. She had examined it for years. She had come to a sort of peace with it, not a warm peace, but a functional one. She knew who she was. She knew what she was good at. She did not need a spotlight to feel real. The Dravet estate sat at the far edge of the old district, behind iron gates that were open for exactly this one night. The driveway was lined with lanterns. The stone building ahead of them was immense and dark and entirely serious, no decoration, no flourish, just scale and age and the particular weight of a place that had watched centuries pass and felt no need to comment on them. They arrived by car, joined the line of other guests moving through the front doors, and entered a hall that Ilara had not been prepared for. It was vast. The ceiling was so high it was nearly in shadow. The walls were dark stone, hung with deep burgundy drapes that swayed faintly in a draft that seemed to come from nowhere. Candles burned in iron chandeliers. The floors were black marble that reflected the light below their feet. There were perhaps 200 guests already inside, dressed beautifully, speaking in low and careful voices, and scattered among them, noticeable by their stillness more than anything else, were members of the vampire court. They did not move the way humans moved. They held their positions like figures in a painting. They were watchful in a way that was not threatening but was impossible to ignore. Ilara looked around the room and, without deciding to, began noticing which guest looked lost. There was an older man near the entrance whose bow tie had come slightly undone and who kept touching it as if uncertain whether fixing it would draw more attention than leaving it. There was a young woman near the window standing completely alone, holding her drink with both hands, looking at the floor. There was a boy, perhaps the teenage son of one of the guests, who had knocked a small tray of glasses from a passing servant's hand and was now crouched on the floor trying to pick them up, his face brilliant red, everyone nearby stepping carefully around him and pretending not to notice. Ilara crossed the room to the boy before she had made any decision to do so. She crouched beside him. She picked up a glass. She told him, in a voice too low for anyone else to hear, that the same thing had happened to her at her cousin's wedding, and that everyone had been very concerned for about 45 seconds and then completely forgotten about it. The boy looked at her. She told him that the secret about dropping things in public was that most people were too worried about their own posture to look at yours for very long. The boy made a sound that started as embarrassment and ended as a quiet laugh. A servant came and helped gather the rest. Ilara stood and smiled at the boy and walked back toward where her mother and Seraphine had stationed themselves near the center of the room. She did not look toward the far end of the hall. She did not know there was anything to look at. At the far end of the hall, seated in a high-backed chair on a raised platform of dark wood, was King Dravath. He was very old. This was not apparent from his appearance. He looked somewhere in his mid-30s, lean, with dark hair and a face that was striking in its stillness. But the age was in his eyes and in the way he occupied space, as if he had simply been present for so long that the air around him had grown used to him. He wore no crown. He wore a dark coat with no decoration. He held no drink. He sat and he watched the room the way someone watches a river, without expectation, without urgency, simply because it is there and moving and it is better than not watching. He had attended every Nightfall Gala since the tradition began. He had met hundreds of guests in this hall. He had shaken hands and exchanged pleasantries and approved the event's continuation because his advisors told him it was good for relations between their wards, and he had never in any of those evenings felt a single thing that could be described as interest. He had seen Seraphine when the family entered. She was the sort of person who was meant to be seen, and she entered a room knowing it, and it was fine. It was familiar. He had met 1,000 Seraphines across the centuries. Lovely, aware of themselves, moving through the world as if it had been arranged for their benefit. He bore no ill will toward that kind of person. He simply had nothing to say to them. He had seen Ilara 3 seconds later. She had walked in behind her mother and her sister and immediately done something he had not expected. She had looked around the room not for people to impress, but for people who needed something. He had watched her eyes move across the space with the particular focus of someone doing a quiet calculation, reading faces, reading postures, reading the small signs that most people learn to ignore because ignoring them is easier than responding. Then she had crossed the room without hesitation, crouched beside a mortified boy on the floor, and said something that made him laugh. Kellen had not moved from his chair in 4 hours. He leaned forward very slightly. His advisor, standing 2 feet to his left, noticed immediately. In 4 centuries of service, Kellen had never leaned forward at this event. The advisor said nothing. He simply watched. Ilara walked back to her family. She straightened her borrowed grey gown. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. She did not look toward the raised platform at the far end of the hall. She had no reason to. Kellen watched her for the rest of the evening. He watched her drift away from her family twice to speak with guests who looked uncertain. He watched her listen, genuinely listen, with her whole body slightly forward, to an elderly woman who had clearly found someone willing to talk to her and was not going to waste the opportunity. He watched her not perform any of this. She was not doing it to be seen doing it. She was doing it because to her, apparently, it was simply the obvious thing to do. When the gala ended and the guests moved toward the exits in a slow, polished current, Kellen finally rose from his chair. His advisor moved beside him. "Shall I prepare your remarks for the departure reception?" the advisor asked. "Send the family voice a formal invitation," Kellen said. "Not to the reception. A private audience. Next week." The advisor paused. "Which member of the family, Your Highness?" Kellen thought of the crimson dress. He thought of the grey gown. The younger daughter, he said. Ilara. He walked from the hall without another word. Behind him, his advisor stood very still for a moment, then reached for his pen. Down by the front gates, Ilara was waiting for her mother to finish saying goodbye to someone she had just met. Seraphine stood beside Ilara, flushed and happy from a very successful evening. She had spoken with 2 members of the court. She had been complimented on her dress by a countess. She was already narrating the evening to herself, already arranging it into a story she would tell for years. Did you have a nice time? Seraphine asked Ilara, not unkindly. Ilara considered. I spoke with a nice old woman named Harriet about her garden, she said. Seraphine smiled the way people smile when they think they understand exactly what happened and they are quietly relieved they had a better time than that. Good, she said. The car arrived. They got in. The lanterns along the driveway grew smaller behind them. Ilara looked out the window at the dark estate and thought about the boy who had dropped the glasses and how he had laughed. That was the best moment, she decided. She was glad she had gone. She had no idea that on the other side of those stone walls, a king who had not been surprised by anything in 400 years was sitting alone in his study, thinking about a great dress and the particular quality of a person who moves toward difficulty instead of away from it. She had no idea at all. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Ilara was at her desk at the publishing house, marking up a manuscript with a red pencil, when her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. She ignored it. Her mother texted frequently and urgently about things that turned out to be neither frequent nor urgent. She finished the paragraph she was reading, made a note in the margin, and then checked her phone. Her mother had sent 5 messages in a row. The last one was in capital letters, which her mother only did when she was either very excited or very afraid, and in this case appeared to be both. Ilara read the messages slowly. Then she put her phone face down on the desk and sat very still for a moment. A formal letter had been delivered to their family home by courier that morning. It carried the seal of the Dravot estate. It was addressed to Ilara Voss. It invited her to attend a private audience with King Kellen Dravot at his estate the following Wednesday at 4 in the afternoon. It requested a response within 3 days. It was written in clean, formal language on heavy paper that her mother described as feeling like money. Ilara picked up her phone and called her mother back. The call lasted 22 minutes, which was long for them. Her mother covered a great deal of ground. She covered the possibility that this was a clerical error. She covered the theory that the invitation was meant for Seraphine and that Ilara's name had been written by mistake. She covered the idea that perhaps Ilara had done something at the gala that caught someone's attention, though her tone suggested she was not sure what that could possibly have been. She covered the practical question of what Ilara would wear. She circled back to the clerical error theory twice more before Ilara was able to end the call. Seraphine called 20 minutes after that. I think it might be a mistake, Seraphine said. Her voice was careful and warm and very slightly tight around the edges in a way that Ilara recognized without comment. It might be, Ilara said. I mean, it's just unusual. Yes. I could come with you, Seraphine said. As support. In case you feel nervous. I know the social environment of the court much better than you do, after speaking with the countess on Friday night, so I could help translate some of the. I'll be fine, Sarah, Ilara said. Thank you. There was a pause. Do you think you'll go? Seraphine asked. Ilara looked at the manuscript on her desk. She thought about the letter. She thought about the estate, its impossible ceilings, its tone and its candles and its absolute seriousness. Yes, she said. I think I will. She sent her response that evening, confirming her attendance. She wrote it herself, in clear, simple language, on notepaper that was not as heavy as theirs but was hers. She thanked them for the invitation. She said she would be there. On Wednesday, she wore a dark navy dress that she actually owned. It was not spectacular. It fit her well. She took the train to the old district and walked the remaining quarter mile to the estate because the evening was cool and she wanted a few minutes to herself. The gates were open. A member of staff met her at the entrance and led her inside. She had expected the throne room, the great vaulted hall with its marble floor and its chandeliers. She had expected to be one small person in a large ceremonial space, arranged at a respectful distance from an elevated seat while something official and brief took place. Instead, she was led down a corridor, up a flight of stairs, and through a heavy wooden door into a room that was entirely different from anything she had expected. It was a study. A large one, but still a study. The walls on three sides were floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, completely full. There was a fireplace with a low fire burning. There were two chairs angled toward each other near a wide window that looked out onto a dark garden. There was a desk against one wall covered in papers and what appeared to be correspondence, and for a moment Ilara had the disorienting impression that she had walked into the office of a very worried person who was simply in the middle of a working week. Kellen was standing near the window when she entered. He turned when she came in. He looked, in daylight, well, in firelight, much as he had at the gala. Still, measured, with that quality of absolute attention that she had not been close enough to feel on Friday night. Up close, it was more noticeable. He was the kind of person who, when he looked at you, appeared to actually be looking at you rather than through you or past you or at the version of you he had already decided existed. "Miss Voss," he said. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for the invitation," Ilara said. He gestured toward the chairs by the window. She sat. He sat across from her. A member of staff appeared silently and placed a tea tray on the small table between the chairs, then disappeared. Kellen did not speak immediately. He looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention and she had the sense that he was doing the same thing she had done when she walked into the gala, reading the room, reading the person, gathering information before committing to a direction. She did not feel the silence. She had learned long ago that feeling silence was a kind of fear, and she was not afraid of him. Cautious, perhaps. Curious, certainly. But not afraid. "I want to ask you something," he said finally. "And I would like an honest answer." "All right," she said. "The boy at the gala," he said. "Who dropped the glasses?" "You went to him." "Why?" She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "Because he was embarrassed," she said. "And no one else went. And it seemed like the obvious thing to do." "Obvious," he said. "To me," she said. "I know it isn't obvious to everyone." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you say to him?" He laughed. "I told him it had happened to me before and that people forget faster than you think they will." "Had it happened to you?" "No," she said. "But it could have." And the point was still true. Something shifted in his expression then. It was not a smile, exactly. It was more like a slight relaxation of something that had been held carefully in place for a very long time. "You lied to make him feel better," he said. "I told him a useful truth," she said, using a fictional example. "That is not quite lying." Now he did smile. It was brief and contained, but it was real. "That is a very specific distinction," he said. It felt like an important one, she said. He poured tea for both of them, which she had not expected. He did it himself, without ceremony, and set her cup on the table in front of her, and she thought that was also interesting but did not say so. They talked for 2 hours. She had not expected 2 hours. She had expected 20 minutes of formal politeness and a guided exit. Instead, they talked about books. He had an entire shelf of contemporary novels he had read in the last decade, which surprised her, and he had opinions about them that were direct and sometimes wrong, which delighted her, and she told him when she thought he was wrong and he listened to her argument with genuine attention rather than the polite performance of listening. They talked about the city and how it had changed in the last 50 years, which he knew firsthand and she knew only secondhand through photographs and her grandmother's stories. They talked about the gala and the tradition of it and whether it served the purpose it was intended for, and he said he was genuinely uncertain about that, and she appreciated the honesty. At no point did he ask about Seraphine. At no point did he make any reference to her family, or her social position, or anything that would indicate he had any information about her beyond what he had observed in the gala hall and what she told him herself. When the 2 hours had passed and she rose to leave, he stood as well and walked her to the door of the study. He told her the visit had been his pleasure. He said it the way people say things when they mean them rather than when they are wrapping up a meeting. She thanked him. She walked back down the corridor, down the stairs, through the entry hall and out into the cool evening. She stood for a moment on the front steps of the Dravot estate and breathed the night air and thought about the 2 hours that had just passed. He had not treated her like a guest to be managed. He had not treated her like a novelty. He had not spoken to her the way powerful people sometimes spoke to people they had decided were interesting in a temporary way. He had talked to her the way you talk to someone whose opinion you actually wanted. She walked back toward the train station. The city lights were beginning to come on around her. She thought about what she would say when her mother called tonight, which her mother absolutely would, and she decided she would say that it had gone well and that he had been very polite, which was true, and that they had talked about books, which was also true, and she would leave the rest of it in the quiet space in her chest where she kept things that felt too real to explain easily. Behind her, in the study on the second floor of the estate, Kellen stood at the window and watched the small figure in the navy dress walk down the long drive toward the gate. His advisor appeared at the study door. "How did it go, Your Highness?" Kellen did not turn from the window. "Send her another invitation," he said. "Next week." The advisor made a note. "And the subject?" "For the purpose of the invitation letter." Kellen finally turned from the window. He went to his desk and sat down and picked up the pen he had set down 2 hours ago. "Tell her I have a book I would like her opinion on," he said. "It will be true?" He found the book on the shelf without needing to look for it, set it on the corner of the desk, and returned to his correspondence. His advisor left quietly. The study was still. The fire burned low. The garden outside was dark and completely silent. Kellen wrote 3 letters and read 16 pages of a report from his Eastern Territories and then sat for a long moment with his hands folded on the desk, looking at nothing. He thought about the specific way she had said, "That is not quite lying," with the small lift at the end that was not quite humor but was its neighbor. He thought about how she had not flinched when he was quiet. He thought about the fact that in 2 hours of conversation, she had not once asked anything about his age, or his nature, or what it was like to have lived as long as he had, the 3 things every other human eventually circled toward, unable to resist. She had just talked to him. As if he were simply a person she was having a conversation with. He could not remember the last time that had happened. He picked up the book from the corner of the desk and turned it over in his hands. It was a novel published 8 months ago. He had thoughts about it. He was curious what she would say. He set it back down and returned to his report. Next Wednesday, he thought. That was soon enough. The 3rd invitation did not arrive the week after the 2nd one. It arrived 3 days after, which was sooner than Ilara had expected. She was on the train home from work when her mother called, and she knew from the first sound her mother made that another letter had come. This time there was no suggestion that it might be a mistake. Her mother had moved past that, into a new phase of response that combined excitement with anxiety in a way that exhausted Ilara within the first 40 seconds of the call. "He sent a book with it," her mother said. Ilara sat up. "He sent a book?" "Yes. A novel. It came with the invitation in the same package. There is a note inside the front cover." Ilara asked her to read it. Her mother read it aloud. It was brief. It said that he had an opinion about the ending and suspected she would disagree, and that he would be interested to discuss it. Ilara looked out the train window at the passing buildings and felt a small, warm thing unfold in her chest that she was not ready to examine too closely. "What does it mean?" her mother asked. "It means he wants to talk about a book," Ilara said. Ilara. "I read it before Wednesday," Ilara said. "I have 3 days." She read it in 2. It was good. The ending was also, she thought, slightly wrong, not badly written, but the author had chosen safety over honesty in the final chapter, and the book was a little less for it. She marked the pages she wanted to discuss and thought about how to say what she thought with the kind of precision that would make the conversation worth having. On Wednesday she arrived at the estate again. Same corridor, same stairs, same wooden door, same study. The chairs were in the same position. The fire was slightly lower. The tea appeared again at the same quiet moment. "You disagree with me," he said, before she had sat down fully. "I haven't heard your opinion yet," she said. "No," he said, "but you came in looking like someone who has something to say." She told him what she thought about the ending. He told her why he thought she was wrong. She explained her reasoning more carefully. He countered it. She reconsidered one part of her argument and adjusted it, which surprised him noticeably, and she could see that it surprised him. Most people, she supposed, did not revise their position mid-discussion when speaking with a king. But she had not come to win the argument. She had come to find out what was actually true about the book. They talked for 3 hours this time. They talked about the book, and then they talked about what makes endings honest, and then they talked about honesty more generally, which led to a long and interesting discussion about the difference between being kind and being truthful when the two came into conflict. He had strong views about this. So did she. They did not agree on everything and neither of them seemed troubled by that. At one point he stood and pulled a different book from the shelf and read her a passage aloud, not to prove his point but to show her where the idea had come from, and there was something about the ease of that, the way he moved through the room and the room moved around him, that made her realize how completely at home he was in this space in a way that went beyond ownership. He had not just lived in this estate. He had been shaped by it. The books on these shelves were not decoration. They were 4 decades of conversation he had been having with the world in the only way available to someone who had outlived most of the people he could speak to. That thought sat with her quietly while they talked. She thought about what it would mean to be that old. She had never thought about it in any real way before, not about the specific texture of it. She knew, in the abstract, that he had lived for centuries. But sitting in this room, looking at the shelves, thinking about the way he listened with the kind of patience that was not simply personality but experience, she started to understand it differently. He was patient because he had seen enough of how things unfolded to know that pushing rarely helped. He was precise because he had spent long enough watching careless words cause damage that he had learned to choose them carefully. He was honest in a blunt and direct way because people who live long enough see the accumulated cost of comfortable lies, and they stop finding comfort in them. On the walk home, she took the long way. Through the park, she thought about those years. What it would mean to read every book published in 4 centuries and still have opinions about them. What it would mean to have built a library not as a symbol of wealth but as a genuine record of thinking. What it would mean to still be curious after all of that. He was still curious. After everything. After watching ideas rise and collapse. After watching people he had known grow old and vanish. She had seen it in the way he asked questions, not going through the motions of inquiry, but actually wanting to know. Not performing interest. Just having it. That seemed like a significant thing to still have. She thought about Seraphine. This happened regularly now, a kind of reflexive self-check, a quiet voice asking whether she was overstepping, whether this attention was really meant for her, whether she was misreading something that had a simpler and more correct explanation. She did not think she was misreading it. She had spent 23 years reading rooms and reading people because no one had told her the rooms were built for her, so she had learned to understand them rather than expect them to understand her. She knew the difference between someone who was being polite and someone who was paying attention. She knew the difference between someone who was passing time and someone who was choosing to be present. He was choosing to be present. She did not tell her mother about the book discussion. She said it had gone well and that they had spoken about literature. This was true and also sufficient. She did not tell Seraphine either, though Seraphine called that evening and asked careful questions with the specific precision of someone trying to understand something they are not sure they want to understand. "Does he ask about the family?" Seraphine said. "No," Ilara said. There was a pause. "Does he ask about me?" Ilara was quiet for exactly 1 second. She kept her voice even. No, Sarah, she said. He asks about me. The silence on the other end of the line lasted much longer than 1 second. Seraphine said good night. She was gracious about it, which cost her something, and Ilara recognized the cost and did not press it. After the call, Ilara sat on her bed with the book on her lap and thought about that silence. It was a complicated thing. There was real feeling in it. There was love between them, she did not doubt that. But there was also a current of something older and less examined that had run through their whole lives, the assumption baked into the architecture of their family that Seraphine came first and Ilara came adjacent, and somewhere in that silence Seraphine was standing at the edge of that assumption and finding that it had, somehow, without announcement, become untrue. Ilara did not feel triumphant about this. She felt a complicated thing she did not have a clean word for. Not satisfaction, not sorrow exactly. Something like the feeling of watching a door finally open that you had stopped expecting would move. The 4th meeting happened 9 days later. This time Kellen met her in the garden rather than the study. The evening was mild and the garden, she discovered, was extraordinary. Ancient trees lined stone pathways that wound through carefully kept grounds. A fountain sat in the center of a circular clearing, its water moving in a soft and even sound that the rest of the garden seemed to arrange itself around. They walked for the first hour. She asked about the trees, some of them were clearly very old, and he told her when each section of the garden had been planted, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had been there. She found herself listening to him describe things he had watched grow from seedlings into the enormous shapes they now were, and she thought again about time, about what it means to have watched things unfold across generations rather than being dropped into the middle of a story already underway. He spoke about the garden without sentimentality. He simply described what had happened, which she had come to understand was his way with everything. He did not perform feeling. He reported it, when it was relevant, in the same clear and measured language he used for everything else. This was something she had initially taken for distance. She had since realized it was the opposite. It was honesty without decoration, which was a rarer thing than most people recognized. Then they sat on a stone bench near the fountain and continued talking. He told her, without her asking, that he had not originally planned to attend the gala this year. His counsel had urged him to appear, and he had agreed out of a kind of institutional obligation rather than interest. He had expected to sit in his chair for 3 hours and feel nothing and return to his study and his correspondence. He told her this without any particular weight behind it, matter-of-factly, as if he were simply providing context for something else he was about to say. She waited. Then I watched you cross the room to a boy on the floor, he said, and I stopped expecting the evening to be what I had expected it to be. She was quiet for a moment. The fountain moved. A breeze came through the trees. What did you expect it to be after that? She asked. He looked at her. Interesting, he said. Which is rarer than people think. She thought about this. You have lived a very long time, she said. I imagine interesting becomes harder to find. Not harder, he said. Just less common in the places people expect to find it. She considered that. And where do you find it? He did not answer immediately. He looked at the fountain. Then he looked back at her. Here, he said simply. She felt the word land and chose not to respond to it too quickly. She looked at the fountain too, and the silence between them was the kind that did not need anything added to it. In the estate behind them, his advisor stood at a second-floor window watching the garden with the slightly stunned expression of a man who had served faithfully for 60 years and had just seen something he had genuinely never expected to see. He had known his kin to be moved by very few things. Ideas, sometimes. A particularly well-argued position. A moment in history that had surprised him. Never a person. Not in all the time he had served. He watched the two of them sitting on the bench by the fountain, talking, and he thought about how still Kellen had been for the last several decades, not unhappy, exactly, but with that particular quality of a person who has reduced their expectations of what a day can contain and has arrived at a kind of settled, functional calm that is sometimes mistaken for contentment. He thought that was not what he was looking at now. He stepped back from the window and returned to his own desk and made a note in his calendar that was not about any meeting. Back home, that evening, Ilara sat on her bed before sleeping and let herself be honest with herself in the way she rarely was when other people were around. She admitted that she looked forward to Wednesdays. She admitted that she thought about the study and the books and the particular quality of conversation that she did not have anywhere else in her life. She admitted that she had started walking more slowly on the way back to the station after each visit, not because she needed the exercise but because she wanted a little more time to hold the evening before the ordinary world came back. She admitted all of this and then she lay back on her pillow and looked at the ceiling and thought, this is real, and I am going to let it be real. That was, she recognized, an unusually brave thing for her to think. Not because the situation was frightening, but because being honest about wanting something, actually wanting it, without immediately building a case for why you probably shouldn't have it, was something she had not been doing for a very long time. She went to sleep. In the morning she got up and went to work and marked up a manuscript and ate lunch in the park and walked home through the soft early autumn air, and the whole day felt slightly lighter than the day before, for no reason she would have been able to explain to anyone else. The fifth meeting was different before it even began. Ilara arrived at the estate that Wednesday to find that Kalen's advisor, a composed older man named Edmund who had met her at the gate every previous time, was waiting for her with an expression that she could not quite read. He told her that the king had been called into an urgent matter with 2 members of his outer council earlier that afternoon and that the meeting might begin slightly late. He asked if she would like to wait in the study. She said yes, and she went up. She had never been in the study alone before. She had always arrived to find him already there. She sat in her usual chair and looked at the room around her, really looked at it, with the unhurried attention she rarely allowed herself when he was present, and most of her awareness was occupied with the conversation. The bookshelves were remarkable up close. She had known they were full but had not registered how organized they were, not alphabetically, not by genre, but in some arrangement that she could not immediately decode. She got up and walked slowly along the nearest wall and looked at the spines. History in one long section, then philosophy, then what appeared to be correspondence and personal documents bound into matching volumes, then fiction, then science, then something she could not categorize at first, volumes that did not appear to be published books but handwritten ones, dozens of them, in the same binding but different sizes. She pulled one very carefully from the shelf and opened it. It was a journal. She closed it immediately, because it was not hers to read, and put it back exactly as she had found it. But even in those 2 seconds she had seen that the handwriting was precise and clear and that the date at the top of the page was from a year that was further back than her grandmother's birth year. She stood very still for a moment with her hand on the shelf. He had been keeping journals for centuries. Of course he had. It was the kind of thing that made complete sense and that she had not thought about until this moment. The sheer accumulation of a life that long, the weight of it, the need to set some of it down somewhere so that it did not exist only as burden. She thought about what was in those volumes. Not the events, exactly, but the thinking. The long working out of what things meant across a time scale no human life could contain. She went back to her chair and sat down. He came in 15 minutes later, still carrying some remnant of the afternoon's difficulty in the slight set of his shoulders, though he released it within a few seconds of entering the room and it was gone before he sat down. "I saw your journals," she said. "On the shelf. I opened one by accident and closed it immediately." He looked at her. There was a moment of something, not quite concern, more like a brief recalibration. "Then, which one?" She told him approximately where on the shelf and what the date had been. He thought about this. "That would have been during a period of significant political reorganization," he said. "It was not a particularly interesting year." "I only saw one line," she said. "I wasn't reading it. I wanted to tell you because it seemed like the kind of thing you should know." He looked at her for a moment. Most people, if they had found those journals, would not have mentioned it. Most people, she said, would have read further. "Yes," he said. And something in his expression was, for just a moment, entirely unguarded. Not emotional in any large sense, just open. The way a room looks when all the lights are on. He got up, went to the section of shelves she had indicated, and pulled out the journal she had described. He found the page, read it for a moment, then turned the book and showed it to her from a distance, not handing it over, just letting her see. It says, he said, that the year was long and that the outcome was acceptable but not what I had hoped, and that I had been grateful for a particular conversation with an old friend in the spring who had since died. He paused. That was a bad year for losing people. She looked at the page. The handwriting was exactly as precise as she had seen it for 1 second. I'm sorry, she said. Not as a formality. She meant it. He put the journal back on the shelf. He came back and sat down. He looked at his hands for a moment and then at her, and she had the impression that he was deciding something. I have not shown those journals to anyone, he said. In a very long time. She understood what he was not quite saying. You don't have to, she said. I know, he said. That is not what I am saying. He got up again, went back to the shelf, and came back with a different journal. He set it on the table between them. He said that this one was from 30 years ago and was less personal, but that it contained some observations about the city that he thought she might find interesting, given how much they had talked about how the city had changed. She picked it up carefully. She opened it carefully. She read. They spent the next hour that way, him explaining context when she had questions, her reading slowly and asking the right ones. It was the strangest and most intimate thing she had done with another person in as long as she could remember. Not because of what the journal said, but because of what he had chosen to do with it. Walking home that night, she thought about trust. Not as a concept but as an action. As a verb. The way it was always a choice, always a small surrender of something, and how the people who were most careful with it were often the ones who had the most to lose. She walked slowly. The city was cool and lit and entirely ordinary around her, and she was entirely not, and she liked the contrast. She liked knowing that the most remarkable thing in her week was a conversation she could not fully explain to anyone else and would not try. She kept it where it lived, in the quiet place in her chest, and she walked home through the park even though it was later than usual, and she was not afraid of the dark, and the whole city glittered, and she let it. When Seraphine asked the question, they were standing in the kitchen after dinner, washing dishes the way they sometimes did when one of them came to visit and their mother had already gone to bed. Seraphine had been building toward it for 20 minutes. Ilara had felt it coming the way you feel weather changing, not from anything specific, just from the shift in the quality of the air between them. Do you think, Seraphine said, very carefully, that he would want you if I hadn't been in the room first? The dish in Ilara's hands was still. The water ran. Outside the kitchen window, the neighbor's cat was sitting on the fence as it did every evening, perfectly still, watching nothing in particular. It was not a cruel question. That was the thing about Seraphine, her difficult moments were never quite cruel. They were honest in a way that cost something, and the cost showed, and that made it harder to be angry at them. She was not trying to wound Ilara. She was trying to understand something that genuinely troubled her. Ilara turned off the tap. She set the dish in the rack and dried her hands on the towel and thought about the question with the same seriousness she gave to every question that deserved it. I don't know, she said, which was true. Seraphine exhaled. Something about that answer had either relieved her or hurt her more, it was hard to tell. I was the one they dressed up, Seraphine said. I was the one they introduced to the court. I spoke with a countess. I did everything right. You did, Ilara said. And then Seraphine stopped. She looked at the window. He didn't even come to speak to me. All evening. He didn't come to speak to any of us. No, Ilara said. But he saw you. Yes. Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. The water in the sink was still. The cat on the fence had not moved. Somewhere in the house a clock ticked with the patient indifference of clocks. Then she said something that cost her more than anything else she had said that evening. What did you do that I didn't do? It was a genuine question. Not rhetorical, not barbed. A real and painful question from a woman who had organized a significant portion of her self-understanding around being the one people noticed, and who was now sitting with evidence that the organizing principle had a gap in it she had not known was there. Ilara thought about the boy on the floor. She thought about how she had moved across the room without calculation, because to her it had been the obvious response. She thought about the 23 years of operating in spaces where she was not the center, and how those years had given her a particular kind of attention, not for herself, but outward, toward other people and what they needed. She thought about how that was not a skill she had developed. It was just who she was. It was the person that had come out of the particular life she had been given. She did not say any of that. It was true, but it was not what Seraphine needed in this moment. She said, "I don't think it was about doing anything, Sarah. I think he just saw something." "What something?" Ilara looked at her sister. Seraphine was beautiful in the kitchen light, tired, a little undone, genuinely asking. It was the most honest Ilara had seen her in years, and it made Ilara love her more than she had in a long time, because honesty at a cost is always more meaningful than honesty that comes free. "I don't know," Ilara said again. "You would have to ask him." She did not say it unkindly. She meant it as a true answer and also as a gentle permission, an acknowledgement that the question was real and that Kaylen's answer would mean more than anything Ilara could offer. She brought that question to Kaylen. Not that night, not the next day, but at the next meeting. She told him about the kitchen conversation plainly, without angling it toward any particular response. She told him her sister had asked whether he would have noticed Ilara if Seraphine had not been there first, and that she had said she didn't know, because she genuinely didn't. "And what do you think?" she asked. He looked at her with that particular steadiness of his, that quality of attention she had thought about frequently in the weeks since the first invitation, the feeling of being actually looked at by someone who was not assessing you but simply seeing you. "I noticed you before I noticed anyone else," he said. "Before your sister had removed her coat from the entrance." Ilara was still. "You walked in," he said, "and you looked around the room the way almost no one looks around a room. You were not checking whether people could see you. You were checking whether anyone needed something." She did not speak. "I have attended these events for longer than I can count," he said. "I have sat in that chair and watched hundreds of people enter that hall. In all of that time, I can count on one hand the number of people who walked in the way you did." He paused. "You did not need to drop anything. You did not need to do anything particular. I had already seen what I needed to see." She felt something move through her that she recognized, after a moment, as grief. Not sadness, not quite, but that older thing, the specific grief of being understood accurately for the first time by someone who had looked without being asked to. She had been seen her entire life. Not the way he meant. She had been seen as the younger one, the quieter one, the one who did not need much. That was a kind of being seen. But this was different. This was being looked at with someone's full attention and having them see, specifically and accurately, the thing that was actually there. She sat with this for a long moment. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Please," he said. "I have spent a very long time making myself smaller," she said. "Not because I was told to, exactly, or not only because of that. But because it seemed like the reasonable thing. The safe thing. When you are not the one people are looking at, you learn to become comfortable in the periphery, and eventually the periphery starts to feel like home." He listened. He did not interrupt. "When your invitations came," she said, "my family assumed it was a mistake. My sister thought she should come with me. My mother thought about what I should wear." She paused. "No one assumed that someone might genuinely want to speak to me." "And you," he said. "What did you assume?" She thought about this honestly. "I thought it might be an error," she said. "I went anyway. Because I was curious. And because even if it was an error, it seemed better to find out than to stay home and wonder." "That was brave," he said. "It was curious," she said. "Those are different things." "Sometimes they are the same," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. I am not going to make myself smaller around you, she said. I am not going to defer to my sister's feelings about this, or manage my mother's expectations of what I should want, or decide that this is probably too much for someone like me to reach for. She paused. I don't know what this is. I know that I look forward to Wednesdays. I know that I come home from here feeling like I have been somewhere real. And I know that I am not going to apologize for any of that. Something in his face was very quiet. The fire moved. The room was still. Good, he said, and his voice was softer than she had heard it, and entirely certain. She went home that evening and had the conversation with her mother she had been building toward for weeks. Not an argument, not an explosion, just a clear, quiet statement. She told her mother that she would not be reducing these visits or framing them differently or approaching them as something surprising and probably temporary. She told her that she was going to stop beginning every sentence about her own life with an apology for taking up space. Her mother looked at her for a long moment across the kitchen table. When did you become this? Her mother said. I've always been this, Ilara said. You just weren't looking. Her mother did not reply. But something moved behind her eyes that was not quite regret and not quite pride and was something of both, and she looked down at her hands on the table, and she was quiet. Ilara kissed her on the cheek before she left and meant it. She was not angry. She never really had been. But she was done waiting for permission to be exactly who she was. On the train home, the city slid past the window in its long river of lights, and she thought about what he had said, that he had noticed her before anyone else. Before anything had happened. Before any proof. She let herself believe it. It was not hard. That was the thing she was still getting used to, that the most true things were sometimes also the most simple, and that believing them did not require years of argument or evidence or the right conditions. It just required deciding to stop explaining them away. She looked out the window at the lights. She stopped explaining them away. She did not go to him angry. She went to him curious. That was the thing her family kept not quite grasping, that her feelings about all of this were not the feelings they expected. They expected some version of insecurity, of needing to be reassured, of arriving at the Dravot estate as a person who needed something confirmed for her. She was not that person. She had not been that person for a while, possibly ever, though she had spent years in a household that could not quite see it. She brought Seraphine's question to the next meeting the way she brought any question that seemed important, directly, clearly, without wrapping it in apology or softening it with extra words. She told him what her sister had asked. She told him that she had said she didn't know. She told him she was asking because she genuinely wanted to know, not because she needed to be told something comfortable. He answered her without hesitation. He told her he had noticed her before Seraphine had crossed the threshold. He told her exactly what he had seen and exactly what had made him lean forward in the chair he had not moved from in 4 hours. He told her about the way she had looked around the room, not for admirers, not to locate the most important person in it, but with a kind of outward attention that was, in his experience, genuinely rare. Then he said, the question your sister is really asking is whether she was the better choice and I chose wrong. The answer is that she was not the choice at all. She was simply there. Most people who attend a room are simply there. You were present in a different way. Ilara thought about this carefully. She thought about the distinction he was drawing between being in a room and being present in it. She thought about how Seraphine moved through the world with the full expectation of being received and recognized, which meant she had never developed the other muscle. The one you built in the absence of expectation. The one that made you look outward because you were not always being looked at. She did not say this to him. She sat with it privately. Thank you, she said. For being honest. I have very little use for anything else, he said. I know, she said. I noticed. That honesty was, she thought, one of the things she trusted most about him. He did not soften things unnecessarily. He did not tell her what she wanted to hear if it was not also what he believed. He had disagreed with her about books. He had told her when her argument had a gap in it. He had let her disagree with him and been genuinely interested in her reasoning rather than merely tolerating it. She had spent her life around people who managed truth, who angled it, who decided what version of a thing to present based on what would be easiest, or most comfortable, or most flattering. She had never particularly blamed them for it, she understood how it happened. But she had also been lonely in the specific way of someone who is surrounded by managed versions of reality and who cannot find anyone willing to just say the actual thing. He said the actual thing. Every time. Without apology or decoration. It was, she had come to understand, one of the things about him that she had been moving toward from the very beginning without fully knowing it. She told him this, that evening, sitting in the garden. The weather was beginning to turn properly and the garden was past its best, the leaves darkening, a sharpness in the air that had not been there a month ago. They had developed a habit, on mild evenings, of sitting outside for the first hour before moving inside, and she had come to love this hour with the particular attachment you develop for things that are soon going to end for the season. She told him that the honesty was one of the things she valued most. That it was something she had looked for in other people for a long time without being able to name it clearly, and that she was only recently able to name it because she had found it. He listened. He was quiet for a moment. You do the same, he said. You may not have recognized it as unusual. She thought about this. I suppose I assumed everyone did it. They don't, he said. Most people tell the kindest version of the truth and call it honesty. She thought about the boy at the gala. The fictional experience she had invented to make him feel better. I sometimes use fiction to tell true things, she said. That is different, he said. That is kindness in service of a true point. That is not the same as managing what someone hears in order to avoid a difficult conversation. She looked at him. You've thought about this a lot. I have had a great deal of time, he said. She laughed, which surprised her slightly, not the laughing, but the ease of it. She had not expected to laugh easily in this garden, in this company. She had not expected to feel this comfortable anywhere so quickly. Later, walking home, she thought about what he had said. She thought about the long accumulation of experience that had produced the person she was sitting beside, not just the years, but what the years had done to his understanding. The way certain things that seemed complicated to her had become simple to him, not because he had stopped thinking about them but because he had thought about them so much that the thinking had arrived somewhere clear. And other things that might seem settled to most people remained genuinely open questions for him, because he had seen enough versions of the answer to know that none of them was final. She found that fascinating. She also found it, in a quiet way, reassuring. That this much living had produced not rigidity but a particular kind of openness, the openness of someone who had stopped needing things to be a certain way and had started simply being curious about what they actually were. She arrived home and changed out of her coat and made herself a cup of tea and sat at her small kitchen table and thought about the word yes. Not the one she had already said in the study, but the larger yes that she had been saying, incrementally, without always noticing it, since the evening she had walked into the Nightfall Gala in a borrowed grey dress and crouched on the floor beside a boy who needed someone. She had been saying yes to herself this whole time. That was the real thing. That was the thread running underneath all of it. Every time she had shown up honestly, every time she had not folded herself small, every time she had answered a question with what she actually thought rather than what was expected, she had been saying yes to who she was. And now someone else was saying yes to it too, clearly and without reservation, and the combination of those two yes was making something she did not yet have a word for. She thought she would have a word for it eventually. She finished her tea. She went to bed. Outside the window the city was doing what it always did, and she was glad it was there, all that ordinary life going on around her, and she fell asleep easily and slept well, and in the morning the day was bright and she got up and went to work and the whole world felt correctly sized for the first time in a long while. He did not propose in the throne room. He did not gather his court or arrange a formal ceremony or send a letter through his advisor. He did not create an occasion. What happened was this. They were in the study. It was a Wednesday evening in late autumn, and outside the window the garden was bare and dark, the trees stripped to their shapes, the fountain quiet because he had told the staff to shut it off for the winter. The fire was strong. They had been arguing about a book for 40 minutes, not angrily, but with the sustained and pleasurable energy of two people who are both invested in the outcome, and Ilara had just made a point that stopped him mid-sentence, genuinely stopped him, and he looked at her for a moment with something very clear and undisguised in his expression. Then he said, "Marry me." Just like that. Mid-argument. While she still had the thread of her last point in her hands. She looked at him. He was not performing it. He was not building toward it. He had simply arrived at a conclusion he had apparently already reached and saw no reason to delay stating. "You're serious," she said. "I would not say it otherwise," he said. She set down the book. She thought about it with the seriousness it deserved, because she gave everything that deserved seriousness the same quality of attention regardless of what it was. She thought about the gala and the grey dress and the boy on the floor. She thought about the first meeting in this room, the 2 chairs, the unexpected tea. She thought about the book that had arrived in the mail with a note in the front cover. She thought about the garden and the fountain and what he had said about interesting being rare. She thought about the kitchen with Seraphine and the conversation with her mother and the train ride home with the city lights and the moment she had stopped explaining things away. She thought about who she was when she came here and who she was when she left, and the fact that those two people had been getting closer to each other each week, until they were almost the same person, and she thought that was probably his doing and also her own. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. Not dramatically, just quietly, like someone who had been holding something carefully and had now been allowed to set it down. They went back to arguing about the book. She won that round, which she was pleased about and which he disputed on grounds she did not find convincing, and the evening continued exactly as their evenings had been continuing, except that now it contained a different kind of weight, not heavy, not difficult, just real in a way that settled into the room and stayed. When she left, he walked her to the main door himself, as he always did now. Outside, the evening was cold and still. She pulled her coat tighter. "Will you tell them tonight?" he asked. She thought about her mother. She thought about Seraphine. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight I want to just know it by myself for a while." He understood this. She could see that he understood it, not just tolerated it, but actually understood it. He did not press. He did not ask what she would say or how she thought they would respond. He simply nodded. "Tomorrow, then," he said. She walked down the drive. The lanterns were on but low, and the garden on either side was dark and bare, and the gate at the end of the drive was lit by a single lamp, and she walked toward it slowly because she was in no hurry, and the night was quiet, and she wanted to be in it for a little while. She told her mother the next morning, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea between them. She said it plainly, without preamble. Her mother stared at her for several seconds without speaking, and then made a sound that was not quite a word and covered her mouth with both hands. "Ilara," she finally said. "I know," Ilara said. Her mother was quiet for a very long time. The kitchen was warm and ordinary around them. The kettle sat on the counter. The curtains were the same curtains they had always had. Everything was completely familiar, and inside that familiar setting something very large had just happened, and they both sat with that for a moment. Then her mother said something that settled something between them that had been unsettled for a very long time. She said, "I'm sorry I didn't look harder." Ilara was still. "I always knew you were there," her mother said. I thought you were fine." "I told myself fine was enough." "I was fine," Ilara said. "That is not the same as seeing you." Ilara looked at her mother across the table. Her mother's eyes were wet, and she was not the kind of woman who allowed herself to cry easily, and the effort of holding it back was visible in the line of her jaw and the particular set of her mouth. "No," Ilara said gently. "It's not." They sat together for a while without saying anything else. The tea grew cooler. Neither of them reached to top it up. The kitchen was quiet. And the quiet was a kind of honesty between them, the first real one in a long time, and they both let it be there. Seraphine came over that evening. She had been told over the phone, which was not ideal, but Ilara had wanted to give her time to arrive at something before they were in the same room. When she came in, she looked composed and slightly tired and entirely herself, which Ilara found reassuring. They sat in the living room. Their mother made herself busy in the kitchen, giving them the space they had not quite asked for. Seraphine looked at Ilara for a moment. "You knew, didn't you?" she said. "Not that first night. But you knew something early." "Maybe after the first meeting," Ilara said. "I didn't let myself think it clearly for a while." "Why not?" Ilara thought about this honestly. "Because I had spent a long time not expecting things to be for me," she said. "It takes a while to stop doing that." Seraphine was quiet. She looked at her hands in the way she did when she was working through something rather than performing thinking. "What was it like?" she asked finally. And the question was quiet and genuine, without any edge. She just wanted to know. So Ilara told her. Not everything, but the important things. The book that arrived with the note inside. The study and the chairs and the argument about endings. The garden and the fountain. Walking home through the park in the dark. The way he asked questions as if the answers actually mattered, not as social ceremony but as genuine inquiry. Seraphine listened without interrupting. She was very still. When Ilara finished, Seraphine said, "That sounds like you." She said it without bitterness, without anything except the simple recognition of something accurate. "Everything you described. The arguing about a book. Going back when you weren't sure. Noticing what he was carrying. That is completely you." "Yes," Ilara said. "I wouldn't have done any of it," Seraphine said. "I don't mean I couldn't, in theory. I mean it would not have occurred to me. To argue with someone like him about a novel. To keep going back without a clearer sign. I would have waited for a gesture I recognized, and I probably would have missed all the ones that actually happened." She paused. "That's not his fault. That's just a thing about me I hadn't thought about before." Ilara said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not either diminish what Seraphine was walking through or rush past it, and it deserved neither. "I'm happy for you," Seraphine said. She meant it. The cost of meaning it was visible, but the meaning was genuine. "I really am. I also need to think about some things. About what I actually want. What I'm actually looking for." She almost smiled. "You've been doing that your whole life." "I'm starting later." "You have time," Ilara said. "You never hated me," Seraphine said. It was not quite a question. "No," Ilara said. And this was true without qualification. "Not even a little." "Sometimes a little," Ilara said. "Mostly no. I understood how things were. I just didn't want them to stay that way." Seraphine nodded. She looked up. "He must be extraordinary. He has very confident wrong opinions about book endings," Ilara said. Seraphine laughed. It was real and sudden and warm. "Tell me," she said. So Ilara told her. They talked for an hour the way they used to when they were younger, before the gap had hardened into something they navigated around rather than across. When Seraphine left, they hugged at the door, and the hug was real, and they both held it slightly longer than necessary. After she left, Ilara stood in the hallway alone and breathed. The announcement was formal and quiet. Kalen's counsel received it without the opposition she had half expected. His head of counsel, a sharp and measured woman named Claire who had served the court for 30 years, met Ilara briefly and assessed her with careful and unhurried eyes and said that the king's judgment was his own and she had long since learned to trust it. There was one moment in that meeting where Ilara could feel herself being weighed, and she met the weight directly and said nothing and let herself simply be what she was, and after a moment Claire had nodded slightly and moved on, which Ilara took as the best possible outcome. The wider court adjusted over the weeks that followed. Kalen gave them the time they needed and no more. He did not ask Ilara to explain herself or prove anything to anyone. He proceeded as if the outcome were already settled, which for him it was, and the world arranged itself around that certainty the way it eventually does around all certainty that is genuinely held. There was an evening, about 6 weeks after the engagement, when Ilara attended a small dinner at the estate. 12 members of the old court, the kind of gathering where every question had a second question inside it and every smile was also an evaluation. She wore a deep green dress, her own, that she had chosen because she liked it. She walked in beside Kellen and felt the shift in the room, not a silence, but that slight reorientation of watchful people recalibrating, and she remembered the gala and the grey dress and the feeling of standing at the edge, and she thought about what had changed. She had not changed. She was exactly who she had always been. She still looked for people who needed something. She still told useful truths with fictional examples when the occasion called for it. She still argued about book endings and preferred to walk when she could and believed the best conversations were the ones where someone ended up thinking differently than they had started. What had changed was who was standing beside her. And the fact that he was standing there not because she had performed something or become something she was not, but because he had looked at what was actually there and said, that one. At dinner she sat beside Claire. They talked about the estate and then about trade arrangements with the northern regions and then, briefly, about a book they had both read and disagreed about productively enough that Claire looked at her near the end of it with an expression that was not quite warm but was its neighbor. Kellen, from across the table, watched this without comment. Afterward, walking back through the long corridor toward the study, Ilara said, "Claire is interesting." "She is," he said. "She decided tonight." "What did she decide?" "That you are worth her time," he said, as if it were a simple statement of fact. Ilara stopped walking. He stopped beside her. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always," he said. "At the gala?" "Before anything else." "When I first walked through the door, what exactly did you see?" He considered the question with the seriousness he gave everything. "A person," he said, "who had clearly been told her whole life to take up less space than she needed. And who had, from the look of it, spent a very long time being good at something no one was watching for." She was quiet. "It takes a particular kind of person," he said, "to be kind without an audience. To do things because they are right and not because someone will see them. Most people are kind when it is easy and when they think someone is watching. Very few people are kind in empty rooms." She thought about the empty rooms. All of them. The years of moving quietly through spaces that were not built for her, doing small true things that no one was watching, being exactly who she was because there was no particular reason not to be. "I had no idea anyone was watching," she said. "I know," he said. "That is how I knew." They walked the rest of the corridor in the easy silence that had been theirs from the beginning, the kind that is not an absence but its own kind of company, the kind that two people can only arrive at together, by choosing, many times, to stay. Years later, when people told the story, and people did tell it, in the way that certain real stories get passed around because they hold something true that people need, they usually started at the gala. The grey dress. The king who did not look where everyone expected him to look. That part was true, and it was a good place to start, and Ilara did not mind it. But the version she knew started earlier. It started in the small ordinary moments that had never been witnessed. It started in all the rooms she had been good in when nobody was looking. It started every time she crossed a space to reach someone who needed something, without calculation, without thinking about who might see. It started, as the real things do, long before anyone was paying attention. She had been told her whole life to let her sister shine. She had. Without bitterness. With love. But she had never stopped being a light herself. She had simply been lighting smaller rooms. Until one night, someone walked into one and finally looked up.